Brings that up.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. Welcome. This is Increasing Rigor Without Compromising Equity. I'm Heather Martin. I am an ESL supervisor.
And I am Erin Vibornik. I teach ESL and Adult Basic Education in the Adult Basic Education Center with Heather. So our objectives today, and first I apologize if you see my eyes going shifty. I'm doing two screens here. So our objectives are first to distinguish between rigor and a barrier. Secondly, to classify tasks or assignments based on the level of complexity of thought required by the students. 3, to adapt an existing activity to incorporate UDL guidelines. And then lastly, to differentiate an existing activity by altering the level of cognitive complexity.
Okay, and just to let you know kind of how things are going to be moving along. First, we'll be talking about what rigor is. Then we will be exploring Webb's depth of knowledge. After that, we'll talk about universal design for learning. And then we're going to kind of overlap the two, and we will have time for questions at the end. That said, if you do have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to either unmute yourself and ask, or you can raise your little Zoom hand. I don't know if we'll see you if you raise your actual hand. But yes, like Erin, I'm also doing the two screen thing. So I apologize for my weird wonky eyes. But anyway, so that is the schedule. And like I said, please feel free to ask questions when you have them.
Great. So Heather and I kind of went back and forth on whether to call this session Increasing Rigor, because there's been some discussion about that word, and we'd be remiss if we just dove in without discussing it. So when we're talking about rigor today, we are talking about it as cognitive complexity. And Jack and Safi call to actually cancel the word rigor. This comes from a September 24th Chronicle of Higher Education article that was put out. And I pulled out a quote here that I think best explains what the issue is. And they say, such rigorous approaches privilege students who already have high academic literacy or who are already adept at managing higher education's unofficial rules, routines, and structures, also known as the hidden curriculum. An emphasis on rigor doesn't necessarily build academic literacy or unpack the hidden curriculum. So perhaps rigor, again, isn't the correct term to really use with our goals, but it has been kind of standardized in education. So I want you to take just a quick minute, because I know everybody's got a phone handy or you're on your computer, and do just a quick, dictionary.com or thesaurus.com search for what the term rigor actually means. So find a synonym, find a quick definition, pop it in the chat. Or if you're feeling brave and you want to unmute and share, you may. Oh, Anna Marie, yes, sudden feeling of cold. Good, Emily, strictness. Okay. I wasn't aware of the cold. Yeah, harsh and flexibility. So those are some of the same things that I found when I looked it up: stiff, rigid, harsh. And these aren't what we want within our lessons, because ultimately it punishes certain students more than others. And as they mentioned, in the article, and I will, we will share some resources, and I'll share this article as well. That again, it's punishing those who don't know the hidden curriculum. So what that means exactly is, in my family, I'm a first generation college student, so I wasn't aware that office hours, when I entered undergrad, the office hours were actually time for me to get help. I thought office hours that's when the teacher works. It's an interruption to go in. Students who come from families with broader higher education might know that's not the case. So it also hurts like our first gen students, perhaps our neurodiverse students, and of course our minoritized students. And oftentimes, we we confuse rigor, making things more cognitively complex, with making it more difficult, and sometimes difficulty translates to throwing up a barrier. And that might not be, again, what we mean to do, but sometimes that is what happens. So before we move on, we're just going to kind of check to make sure that we're all on the same page about going forward what we mean by rigor as cognitive complexity versus a barrier. So here are 3 examples, and we'll go one at a time, and in the chat you can just type in whether it's a rigor or a barrier. So in 1, I worry that the reading for this week is too short. So I'll also assign 3 peer-reviewed journal articles so that it doesn't seem too easy. So is that increasing rigor, or is that adding a barrier? Lori was on top of it. That was quick. Either you're a quick typer or you had that ready. Exactly. It is a barrier. Why? Because the only reason for adding it in there is the assumption that the reading was too short. Fantastic. Disadvantaging students who, maybe don't have time to do all of that, or need additional cognitive processing time, and you've just thrown 3 peer-reviewed journal articles at them. Maybe Stacy would disagree, but for me, those are tough. So number 2, the skill that I'm teaching is essential for employability. Instead of having students take a multiple choice test to show their understanding, I'll include it in a project where they apply this skill in a new but applicable situation. Fantastic. Exactly. Number 2 is rigor. And we'll, in a moment, Heather will dive into exactly why that's rigorous. And then the last one, my objective for this lesson is that students will be able to define key vocabulary words. I'm showing them a video. 25% of my students are English language learners. I'm going to keep the closed captions and subtitles off so that they can practice listening too. Fantastic. Absolutely. It's a barrier. It is not aligned to the objectives whatsoever. It's just throwing up something to, again, seemingly make it more difficult, but really it's just increasing a barrier for very specific students in class. Fantastic. So now Heather will take it over here to take a deep dive into cognitive complexity.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions about rigor or barriers before we move on? Do you not see any Zoom hands or real hands? Okay. So today we're going to talk a little bit, I'm going to talk a little bit about Webb's depth of knowledge. And I feel like, I don't know, I recognize some faces, but normally I talk about Bloom's taxonomy, which is, I think, a little bit more commonly referred to as kind of a gauge of cognitive complexity. But the reason we're using Webb's depth of knowledge today is because Webb's depth of knowledge is specific to completing various tasks. So it's a framework that describes level of thinking required for students to complete specific tasks. Now, what that means, can you see, I don't know how small that is on your screen. Is that super tiny? Because I can pull up, all right. Erin, I'll pull it up in a minute. I will describe it first and then we'll pull up a bigger version. So you'll see that there are 4 levels of cognitive complexity. The first one, level 1, is recall. And in each one of these kind of pie slices, you will see different verbs that are affiliated with that specific level. So first we have level 1 recall, and you see things here like tabulate, recognize, name. And when I think of level 1 recall, what I think of is really things that are just a one-step process for the students. So they're basically regurgitating information that you've already given them. In level 2, we have skill and concept. So those are things like categorizing, identifying patterns, organizing. And again, these are things that are not, thank you, Erin, very much for putting that in. These are things that are not super complex for students, but it's more than just the regurgitation of information, right? Maybe they have to categorize the information that you've given them, or maybe they have to compare information that you've given them, or that they've, read or whatever. They might have to organize it or make predictions based on it. So it's taking that information and it's doing something to it. There's a specific, like a singular process that they're doing to this information. Level 3 is strategic thinking. And in strategic thinking, we're extending beyond level 2, obviously. And you see verbs like formulate, critique, develop a logical argument, cite evidence. So here they're really kind of pulling from various sources to really, sorry, let me just scroll down here, to really take what it is that they've been given and kind of, I'm sorry, pull from other, I have too many screens open, pull from other sources to be sure to like apply it to different places. And then lastly, in level 4, we have extended thinking. And what extended thinking is when they're really taking what you've given them and they're synthesizing. This is when they're taking it and they're going beyond what you've given them. They're applying it to completely new contexts, and they're kind of building on it in their own way. So before we jump into the next part, I do want to kind of review this and give you an opportunity to, oh, I'm sorry, there we go. Forgot that slide was just completely lost on me. Give you an opportunity to identify different or put different activities into different levels of Webbs. And before we do that, sorry, my camera is blocking I'm having some tech issues today, blocking my little tabs. Anyway, before we do that, I just want to review this because I was scattered last time. So again, first is just recall. They're taking the information and they're giving it back to you in a very similar form. Skills and concept, they are taking one more mental step. So they're taking the information and they're doing one thing with it. And they must choose how they're doing it or what the approach is. Strategic thinking, the tasks can consist of multiple valid responses, right? So you're not just looking for one specific answer. It could be a number of different answers. So it might be an opinion. It might be choosing something that they think is a direct cause of maybe an important event or something like that. And they must be planning, using evidence and abstract thinking. And then the last one, extended thinking, they're requiring, I'm sorry, clearly I did this very late at night, complex cognitive energy. Students synthesize information from multiple sources and they transfer that knowledge between the domains, which was the wording I was looking for before. So what we are going to do now is we have a list of kind of simple activities, and we're going to be classifying them by which level of Webb's depth of knowledge they correspond to. And one thing I want you to remember before you do this is that, first of all, there's no one specific answer. You'll notice on the wheel that there are several verbs that fit into multiple kind of pie slices. For example, let's see, compare is in a few of them. And, a lot of times I bring up multiple choice questions when I talk about complex cognitive complexity. And the reason is there are so many ways that you can phrase a question and there are so many things you can ask for. So if you're giving a student two items and you're asking them to compare, that's a lower level concept. If you are giving the student something and asking them to draw from their knowledge from another unit or from another domain or from another context and asking them to make that comparison, then you're moving around the wheel to level 3. So that's why you will see some things in multiple slices there. And then the other reminder that I wanted to give you is that you do not, or students do not have to master level 1 before they move on to level 2. This is not necessarily a pyramid. It's a wheel for a reason. So you can work around it and move through it fluidly when you're planning. And again, it's not about difficulty. Like Erin said, it's about complexity. So knowing that, we are going to take a look at these examples and kind of guess which, it's not guess, take an educated guess or make a declaration of which level of Webb's you correlate it to. And again, there's not necessarily an exact science here. So the first example is summarize or write an outline of a chapter in your textbook. Which level do you think that is? Do you think that is, let's see, recall? Do you think it is skill or concept? Right, we've got a couple people saying level 1. I agree. This is level 1 because the students aren't doing anything with the information. They're giving it back to you, right? And this is an important skill for them to have, right? It's not a bad activity, but there's not a whole lot of processing going on. Number 2, debate a topic. Yep. Okay, so I see some 3s, 3 and 4. I agree. I had this down as a 3. And it's because there are different possible outcomes, right? There's not one specific response that you're looking for from students. When you ask them to debate a topic, they are allowed to, state their claim, and then they have to cite evidence. They have to pull in their evidence. They have to find the evidence. So this is definitely a higher level activity. All right, number 3, create graphs or charts to organize data and information without instructor prompts. Okay, I see a lot of 2, 3. I think this example is one that completely depends on the context in which you're giving it. So if you, I mean, this specifically says without instructor prompts, but because we're going to be talking about differentiation eventually anyway, if an instructor gives the students data and they say, here, make some type of visualization, right? We're like level 2 and 3 there, right? Because the students are being given the data. Maybe the instructor will provide specific guidelines of what they're looking for with the visualization. Maybe the instructor will not provide those guidelines. Or you could potentially have the students collecting data and organizing it, and then creating graphs and charts. If it's an autonomous process, if the students are responsible for collecting the data, for organizing the data, for creating those visualizations, we're talking like 3, 4. If the students are just kind of repackaging data that's been given to them by the instructor, then I agree, it's a 2 or 3. So this one's definitely dependent on the context. All right, number 4, write a journal entry or reaction to a reading assignment. All right, we've got a couple people saying 2. I agree. And yes, Lori, that's a really good point. It depends on the reading in other directions. Yes, if it's one specific, read the chapter and write a reaction, we're talking like 2. If it's pull from these different sources and find different examples, then absolutely. If you're having them cite evidence, of course, then you're working your way around that wheel. But the reason that I felt like write a journal entry or reaction was important is because I think as an instructor, when you assign a chapter, for example, to read, and then you can have the students write a reaction or respond, right? Some type of journal entry, or you can have them summarize and write an outline. When we think about the output, it's very similar. right? When we think about the product that the students are creating, it's very similar. They are handing us basically like probably like half a page to a page, right? And they are basically highlighting the important parts of the chapter in one way or another. However, if they're summarizing and doing outline, that is not as cognitively complex as a journal entry or a reading assignment. So even though the product that you are receiving as the instructor is very similar, and your process as far as like reading and grading and things like that is similar, it's a similar demand on your time. For the students, it is more cognitively complex to have them responding with their own thoughts and their own reactions and their own feelings about what they read. So let's see, number 5, create a timeline of important events in World War II. Yeah, 1, 2. And again, it would depend on what you gave them. I personally associated this with a 1 because chances are they've been given some important events in World War II. However, if you want to say like, you know, analyze these or pick the most important events, or maybe you've given them different, thank you, Lori, exactly. So if they've been given a list of important events or a time, like some kind of, not timeline, but like a narrative of a timeline, then it's a level 1. If you are having them pull from different sources, or you are having them distinguish which events are most important and defend which events are most important, then absolutely that increases the rigor tremendously. And then the last one, analyze and draw conclusions from data, citing evidence. Yeah, lots of 3s and 4s. I would put this in a 3, depending on what you have them do with it. If you are having them draw conclusions and cite evidence, and that's kind of the end, then I would probably put it around a 3. If you are having them maybe make predictions or apply what conclusions they've drawn to another context, then once you cross those domains, that's when you go from level 3 to level 4. So it really depends on what you do with it. Before we move on, does anyone have any questions about identifying the different levels of Webbs or about the levels in general? All right, I see no hands, real or otherwise.
All right. Yeah, I think that activity really highlights the fact that just the littlest changes in context, kind of not just what you do, but where you're going along that path really changes, again, that cognitive complexity. So there's
I
a lot to
found a lovely graphic, and actually sometimes I find weird little things and I'm like, oh, Tyler would love this. So I found a graphic that actually had on one side, it was kind of a T-chart, and on one side it had Bloom's taxonomy, and on the other side it had Webb's, and it was taking different types of activities that it kind of mixed and matched, and it showed like something that might be in level 4 on Webb's that might be a lower level on Bloom's and vice versa. It was very exciting, Tyler.
If you can pull that up, let's share that
I will find it
at the end. So
yes.
if there are any other assessment nerds here who are thinking, ooh, I want to see that. So we have the framework now for determining the cognitive complexity or the rigor of something. But again, our title here is not just increasing rigor, but it's increasing rigor without compromising equity. And it's, as we'll see, kind of a really delicate dance between these two things. But I'm going to walk through very briefly universal design for learning, because that is the framework that we're going to use for kind of ensuring that there is equity, that there is appropriate differentiation and accessibility built into lessons. And again, it's going to be a quick dive into it if you want to hear a lot more about it. And I'm sure Tyler can plug as well that CETL will have some workshops in April that you'll be able to attend if you want to dive into it a bit more. So again, to increase equity, we can, again, design our assessments and lessons according to Universal Design for Learning guidelines. And according to the CAST website, which is the organization that put together these guidelines, UDL is a framework to improve and optimize learning, teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how humans learn. So I'm going to start slowly here and just preface by saying the UDL guidelines can be really overwhelming at first. There's a lot there. So I'm going to start by highlighting the main categories that we use to talk about assessments and lessons. So the main categories are engagement, representation, and action and expression. And for each one of these, so the goal of UDL is to create expert learners, learners beyond the classroom. So the goal in the engagement category is to create expert learners who are purposeful and motivated. Through the representation category that we'll look at, we want expert learners who are resourceful and knowledgeable. And through the action and expression category, the goal is expert learners who are strategic and goal directed. And I'm sure all of us are thinking, yeah, an expert learner with all of those qualities would be fantastic. So again, you'll notice this expert learner goal. It's focused on not memorizing and regurgitating content. And again, recall in Heather's discussion of Webb's depth of knowledge that there are those different levels of cognitive complexity. So let's move on. I will type this. Oh, wow. Thank you, Heather. I was ready to.
You're welcome. Got it.
Okay. Actually, I think I will, if you don't mind being the driver, if it becomes too challenging, I can take over.
No worries.
But if you could open up, so this is the CAST kind of homepage, and when you click on the lovely little chart in the upper right-hand corner, it opens up the UDL guidelines. So there are many of them. Let me make my screen a bit bigger to make it easier to see. So you'll again notice those three columns, those three categories of engagement, representation, and action and learning. And you'll also notice that it focuses on different parts of, or they highlight it as different parts of the brain. Engagement focused on our affective networks, representation is our recognition networks, and action expression are the strategic networks. You'll also see that as the chart goes down, it gets, it changes kind of its focus. So that first row is focused on access. The next row is focused on build. And then the very last one is on internalize. And the goal in creating a lesson, an equitable lesson using UDL, is not just to cherry pick a few things, but to consider all of these as you approach lesson or assessment creation. So it doesn't mean you're going to use all of them, but to be aware of and to think through kind of your options and how you could, again, kind of make it more accessible to all students. I also want to just quickly point out that it does at first glance appear that there's kind of a silly numbering system, right? For example, you'll see the first column starts with 7s, the next one starts with 1s, 2s, and 3s, and the next one is at 4s. That's just kind of based on how the order in which they were originally created, and then then they were kind of reorganized, and the guidelines are currently being reviewed again to try to incorporate more specific language about racial and about racial equity as well, kind of combining culturally responsive teaching in with UDL. So let me point out how to navigate through these guidelines, because I'll admit the first time I saw this, I didn't realize I could actually click on these things. So I was reading the headers thinking, what exactly does it mean, optimize individual choice and autonomy? So if you could click on that for us, Heather, under recruiting interest, it opens up a nice page that gives you some examples. And it kind of builds from row to row. So here we're offering students choice, and it can be choice in what they are doing, or it can be choice in how they are accessing information. Again, instead of handing somebody a physical document for everything in class, also providing an option in D2L where they can go in and they can change the font size, they can change the font, they can make those little changes themselves to make it more accessible for them, easier to see, perhaps easier for them to click and get a translation into a different language. If we hop back, I'm going to kind of focus right now on the on our first column of engagement here and go down to the build category, 8.4, increase master-oriented feedback. And you'll see here it's in the build category because, again, this mastery feedback is focused on the objective, focused on your outcome. In our ESL classes, that might mean I forego mentioning all of the other little grammatical errors that I'm seeing, but if the purpose was for them to reflect, I am engaging in it with mastery-oriented feedback on the reflection and the content. If the grammar wasn't part of that objective, then it gets set aside for a moment so that we can engage again in that mastery oriented feedback. So that's kind of, again, building. And then in self-regulation, 9.3 has develop self-assessment and reflection. Again, you can see it has some examples here as well, but allowing students to chart their progress, and charting their progress meaning more than just checking D2L to see what their scores are, but and this relates, all of this kind of is a kind of a spider web of different things. This actually connects to something under action and expression where you're asking them to set goals and to track those goals. And this self-assessment and reflection is connected to that, right? Students are saying, okay, maybe I'm still not getting an A on my quizzes, but hey, look, I've improved in this way. Maybe my grade hasn't improved, but I actually set a study schedule and I stuck to it, right? So that students are able to see progress in other ways than just grades. So again, this was a very quick dive into it. If we can hop back to like the main thing, and we'll just take the bird's eye view of this. We don't have to click into it anymore. And then in representation, you see it builds from perception to language and symbols. Very important if you're teaching language or especially math. There are a lot of examples in the 2.3 support decoding of text, mathematical notation and symbols. If you're interested in, well, how does this apply to mathematics? And then again, comprehension. So you see it kind of, they build upon each other a bit. At that bottom row, we've got self-regulation, comprehension, executive functions. These are very high level things that we want learners to be able to do. And then in action and expression, um, you're giving them different tools and assistive technologies. You're making that available for everybody instead of just saying, hey, if you need text into audio, you know, figure it out, or just assuming, well, students will be able to find what they need. You are actually providing those things for them. Expression and communication, giving them graduated levels of support, a great tie-in for Webb's depth of knowledge, those graduated levels. And then executive functions. Again, this is where that goal setting comes in. So again, a very high level flyover approach. So I do, before we kind of apply this to a lesson, I want to give an opportunity to answer any questions that are popping up about universal design for learning. Okay. I assume that means I love UDL. I can't wait to learn more, and I'm registering for that CETL workshop as we speak. So we're going to do a bit of kind of whole group practice right now with adapting a lesson to improve access and equity by using UDL. So I'm going to share the link in the chat for this as well. I've put the QR code in case you don't have multiple screens in front of you and it's easier for you to, oh, thanks, Heather. If it's easier for you to have the lesson open on your phone and this screen or the UDL screen open on your computer. But it will help to have both of those things open. So I'll give one more moment. If you are new to QR codes on your phone, you just open up your camera app. You look like you're about to take a picture of that box. And at least on an iPhone, a little yellow button pops up underneath it for you to press, and it opens it directly. I'm not sure what it looks like on Android, but again,
Similar. It's just
okay.
Instead of yellow, it's white. Yeah.
I didn't know you were Android. That kind of works. We've got
Yeah, look at that. Look at
two
us
different
complimenting each other.
right. And you do have, just a warning, you do have editing access of this because we will use this again in the future. So just so you are aware if things get moved around. All right. So Heather, if you could share the lesson up on the screen.
Got it.
Oh,
Come on.
perfect. Thanks. All right. So here we have a lesson with the objective of write smart goals. Our topic is goal setting. Hopefully this will be kind of widely applicable to people from different departments and different areas. And as you can see, it's kind of categorized a short walkthrough of this lesson, activating prior knowledge, the teaching portion, the assessment, and the closing. So I'll give you a second to read through it because you don't need me to read it to you, as well as to open the kind of the corresponding PDF image of what the students will see. So I'll give about 2 minutes to look through that. I'm notorious for having no concept of time. I constantly tell my students, like, I'm going to give you 10 minutes to work on this. And then I completely forget to check the clock. So I never know when 10 minutes have passed. All right. So the next step of what we're going to do here is to look at this through the lens of universal design for learning. So that's our first step that we're going to walk through here. And looking at both what this lesson does well and what things it could definitely improve upon. So we can talk through this. You can type things in the chat. I know it might take a few minutes because you have to look back at that UDL guideline chart. But also, of course, you don't have to point out specific things on that UDL chart. If there's just something in your brain saying, oof, this is neither accessible nor equitable, you can throw that out there and we can help to kind of point out where that's falling on the UDL chart. So what do you notice about this lesson? Let's start with the engagement category. And a little reminder of what that means. So you don't have to do too much hopping back and forth. Yeah, recruiting their interest. Do they have choice and autonomy? Is this authentic? Have you minimized threats and distractions? Are you varying the demands and resources? Are they collaborating? Is there master-oriented feedback? Are they developing self-assessment and reflection?
We've got Emily said that students may need real life examples of goals set and met.
Fantastic. Absolutely. Let me pull up my,
Oh, you want me to switch
I
back?
took extensive notes and that was, what do I do? I need like 12 monitors.
I know that was the problem I was having earlier. I feel terrible. Yeah, they're everywhere.
Right.
The tabs. So many
Exactly.
tabs.
So Emily, yes, I said no examples were given to students. And I aligned that with 3.2. So with comprehension in the representation column, I said, it doesn't highlight patterns, critical features, big ideas, or relationships. You're giving them nothing. Lori says opportunities to write and state examples. Absolutely. Yes, Stacy, this lesson right now has no collaboration. So if we're looking in our green column here for engagement, they are engaging with really nothing more than their paper and pencil for this. And I think we made obvious by the fact that we're all here in professional development today. We know that collaboration and working with others has value, and that's not evident in this lesson.
Something else Erin said is that they are engaging with their paper and pencil. So the whole lesson is paper and pencil. And when I think of UDL, Erin and I think, have very different approaches to UDL, because Erin, I am not the person that's going to say, oh, that's 3.2 like Erin is. Erin is fantastic. And she knows that matrix. And when I'm much more of a big picture person. And so one of the first things I think of is just like very base level. How are the students getting the information? Like what's the input and what's the output? And if all of that is paper and pencil, then that is a whole lot of different learning preferences and neurodiversity that you are not appealing to. So yes. And I'm sure Erin can tell you what number that is on the matrix.
I was just going to say, as the detail-oriented person, I would say that the fact that there's only one way that information was shared, that comes in as I feel like a flight, like a pilot, that clocks in as a 2.5 in the middle. In that purple
Right
language
here.
and symbols, we're
Mhm.
only illustrating through one sort of medium right there. And we have only one way for students to respond, and that is part of the action expression. That the top of that blue column says vary the methods for response and navigation. We've given them nothing.
Rick also said make this a discussion question so they can talk about each other's goals. They can interact and collaborate.
Absolutely. And that's Rick, I love that, because that's not just collaboration, but that's reflection too. So now we've moved down into where are we here? Down into self-regulation, right? They're, you could even build that in where you're asking them to self-assess their goal, to reflect upon their goal. And exactly, Stacy, information on the PDF could be shared in different ways as well. Absolutely. I had a long list of ways this could be improved.
I'm sure Tyler and probably Tammy would have a lot to say about PDF and accessibility.
Absolutely. And we really, we have a lot of options, with the fact that we have D2L, we have a very distinct place for us to share information, or different forms of information with our students as well. So I do want to draw a couple attention to two things that it actually did do that align with UDL. The first is it did provide a graphic organizer. So that was good. So it did that for students to they could write on it, they could fill it out in each of those categories. And it did activate prior knowledge. It just wasn't as effective as it could have been. So yes, so this kind of gives us a framework for how to approach our lessons, our assessments with equity, with differentiation really in mind and at the heart of it. But again, we need to also make sure that it is cognitively complex. So I'm going to, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, but I want to throw this back to Heather so that she can kind of tie all of this together.
Right. So thank you, Erin. In addition to making sure that we have that UDL component, that our lessons are accessible for students and I mean, universally, right? That's kind of right. That's what the U stands for. But on top of that, we want to make sure that we are varying. We do have various options for complexity. So first of all, what level of complexity do you associate this with? 1, 2, 3, or 4? And then let's think about some things we can do to both increase or decrease the level of complexity for this activity. So first of all, where do you think this is on the wheel? Do you want me to pull up the wheel? I can pull up the wheel. Oh, God, it's so many tabs open. I'll get the wheel. Give me a minute. All right, Rick says 1, maybe 2, because he is faster than I am with the wheel. So thank you. I would agree with Anthony on this. It's a 2. And the reason for that is because you're not giving them the information, right? The students are the ones, they have to have that reflective process, like we talked about in the examples, where this is more like a journal entry or a reaction, right? Because they are processing, right? They think about their goals. They do have to think about their lives in that context. And then they have to create that information and output. So that said, what are some ways, so I kind of gave it away, but what's one way we can make this less complex if students need more support? Yeah, exactly, Stacy. Definitely provide examples. You can, and we talked about providing examples. I think Emily brought it up earlier in the chat when we were talking about UDL, but not only does providing examples make this more, a little more UDL friendly, but it also provides students with supports. So it could be as simple as providing some examples. You could also provide a list, right? Like a lot of times I think of our low ESL students that have those like language barriers. And a lot of times we will give a list. We will give, hey, here are a bunch of different options. Which options look good to you, right? And so that is one way that the students, you can bring that around to a level 1, is just providing the students with some options and not making them create the list themselves, right? They're just handpicking the ones that are applicable to them. All right, and let's say we want to make this more complex. How can we make this more complex? I love that. Yeah. Emily, compare how setting and not setting goals contribute to success. A series of goals leading to a larger goal, connected to a long-term goal. Exactly, right? By taking it outside of the context of this assignment, right? What are the goals, right? Here are the goals for this month in class, right? It's very specific. It's level 1 if we provide a list of goals and have them choose. It's level 2 if we have them create their own goals. And then if we want it to go to level 3, level 4, we could either extend it beyond. We can say, well, what about the semester? What about your other classes? How will this overlap with your personal goals, and turn it into like a time management situation? We could also have smaller goals. Okay, well, here's your goal in class. Now let's make some mini goals and see how how those little goals are going to contribute to this larger goal. Yes, how to measure attaining the goal. Exactly.
I love that.
So all these extend the thought process beyond one goal for this month in class. Yeah, and by doing that, you're catering to this, well, not catering, but you're allowing the students that are able to extend that extension opportunity. Similarly with the list, you are providing those students that need extra support, the support that they need. And then, one thing I think about, and I say this, Tyler, I feel like hears me say this every time every time he hears me say anything, this is part of it. But it's important when you do have an objective, you make sure that you're measuring that objective. Like Erin earlier brought up the example of, oh, this reading is really short or easy. I'm just going to throw on 3 peer-reviewed journal articles. Right. And I think so often we think about the amount of work we're giving our students, credit hours, things like that. But at the end of the day, it's like, do they need to read this much to understand, or are they able to demonstrate their understanding of this objective without all the extra reading? I think the same way about like length requirements for writing. It's like, well, can they explain it in fewer than 5 pages? Or, is it absolutely necessary to have 5 pages to completely explain their understanding? So there used to be a PowerPoint here somewhere.
And that's really key in combining these two things, is going back to that outcome. Because you might think, oh, well, you said if we provide students with more support, it might bring us down to a level 1. I want this to be more cognitively complex. Again, going back to that outcome, taking that outcome and kind of laying it over Webb's and saying, what level of cognitive complexity is this? And then going to UDL and kind of making sure that you have all the supports that you're able to provide.
Because students can still, like, you can ask students to provide like an extension, right? Like a level 4 activity, right? To demonstrate that type of understanding and that type of process with the output. But you can also provide them supports that they need to get there. So just because you provide them with supports does not mean that they are not having that extended thinking process. And I think that's something that we often, we're all overwhelmed. And I think it's kind of almost like a mental shortcut that we take without realizing that we're doing it. It's like, oh, well, no, like if my students are going to show me this complex thing, then they have to do the work. But really, we have to make sure that we provide them with the supports so that they can succeed in showing us that complex extended thinking. So what questions do you all have?
I can ask one question. One thing I'm kind of thinking about is just the significance of reflection within what you both shared. So I think that reflection is really key to UDL, and reflection also is kind of a go-to or a way to sort of immediately increase rigor. And so I'm wondering, within practice, do you encourage incorporating reflection in daily lessons in addition to assignments? Do you kind of err on the side more of reflection paired with assignment within every single activity lesson? What advice would you give on kind of pulling reflection into teaching?
I think one thing about reflection is that it can be done in so many different ways. Like it can be as simple as an exit ticket with like a little like smiley face to frowny face and like gauge your understanding or highs and lows of the class, or it can be done in a more, in-depth process with like an entry or a response. Erin, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, I again go back to the outcome, the objective, and in that lesson, if there's a particular skill, like if it is like, let's say level 4, I really want them to reflect on that skill, right? How, and kind of peeling it apart, like what was their process for analyzing something? How did their process differ from somebody else's? Kind of reflecting on that to make them, it's that metacognition, making sure that they're aware of how they're learning. And then yes, sometimes it is, if it's a reflection on the content and through an exit ticket. Exactly.
And an important point that Erin brought up is that objective, and the importance of communicating those objectives so that you do get the targeted reflection process that you're looking for from the students. And I know Terry had a hand.
That's also one of the most difficult things to get them to do. If it's an exit ticket, that's the easiest because they're right there and they're writing what they have done. And that's not always in-depth thinking when they're reflecting.
No.
But I'll even attempt to I just gave my students a poll in an online test. And I said, what do you want to write? A reflection paper and a research paper. Now, what do you think that the majority wants?
Reflection.
Yep.
They do the reflection, or did they do the research?
They want the research because they want to read the material and rehash it into a thing. They don't want to reflect. They don't want to get to that stage 4. That's the most difficult thing I deal with.
Interesting.
Anybody else?
It's certainly something that takes practice. I think sometimes, and not sometimes reflection is kind of an afterthought, like, oh, reflect on this.
They don't want it.
But having to actually, right, it's a skill.
In the 3rd and 4th level, they don't want it. In the 1st, it's okay, but you still fight them, and I've been teaching for 20 years, so it's getting a little bit worse right now.
I love that you gave them that choice though.
Yeah.
I try to, but I've got to find more interesting ways.
Yeah.
Thanks, Stacy.
I saw Stacy celebrating with the research.
Yeah. Lori started assigning reflections at the end of the course.
You need a shirt that says level 3, come to me.
Right. We'll all walk around with Webb's wheels on our shirts.
We need a shirt that says let's get to level 3.
Yes.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think Lori made a good point about giving the reflection at the end versus in the middle. Then, just smaller chunks. Smaller, just bite-sized chunks was definitely one thing.
And Perry, I've seen the same thing. If I do an exit ticket, I get whatever the last thing is we did. They've forgotten about the first thing in class.
Fun, or there's something that was really fun, or they're just being picky, like, well, what's going to be on our next test?
It is. And there are different levels of different uses for the instructor for that. Obviously, if it's something like an exit ticket, it's very quick feedback, but if there is more detailed, like a deeper process from the students and a more thorough output, then obviously you can take that and use it much more effectively. But yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, well,
Well, thank you all for coming. I have our email addresses are up there, and you can email us with whatever you want.
Great. And Tyler, will there be a way for us to kind of easily disseminate any additional resources and things to participants?
Absolutely, yeah.
fact?
So we
Okay,
can do a
great.
couple things. We can send it to everybody in a bunch via email, also post it to the CETL site, very likely.
Great.
But definitely.
Okay.
Okay. Well,
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.
And